I woke up one morning with a quiet panic lodged in my chest, the kind that made even the familiar walls of my bedroom feel like a cage I hadn't noticed before. For months, maybe years, I had been living a life measured in habits, routines, and polite social expectations, until the point arrived where I could no longer ignore the dissonance between who I appeared to be and who I felt myself becoming. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't dramatic, but it was unavoidable. I realized I was standing at a crossroads, and the path I was on demanded honesty I hadn't been willing to offer myself. I had always been meticulous, disciplined, a person who measured consequences before making choices. But now, in the silence of that morning, I faced a truth that was neither neatly quantifiable nor socially convenient. I could not unsee the parts of myself that had been quietly asking to exist in ways that defied the assumptions I had spent decades internalizing. There was fear in that realization, not the sensational kind, but a slow, pressing awareness that life would feel irreversibly different once I acknowledged it. The first tentative steps were private. I found myself drawn to mirrors not to admire, but to understand how my body moved, how clothing could alter not just my image, but my perception of myself. I approached it experimentally, almost scientifically, cataloging each sensation, each moment of discomfort, each flicker of relief. My mind churned with questions. Who would I become if I let these impulses shape my daily life? Would my relationships endure? Was I betraying expectations, or simply discovering a neglected honesty? My wife noticed before I could explain. Not with accusation, but with a quiet, careful observation that unsettled me more than any judgment ever could. She didn't push, she didn't pry. She simply said, "I see you," in a way that made me both relieved and terrified. Relief because someone I trusted recognized my truth, terror because acknowledgement demanded response. I had no template for what came next, only the raw awareness that my choices carried weight not just for me, but for the people who loved me, and for the integrity I still wanted to preserve in my own eyes. In those first weeks, the transformation felt largely internal. Each day was a negotiation between comfort and exposure, between secrecy and authenticity. I experimented with voice, posture, clothing, small things that allowed me to inhabit my emerging identity without stepping fully into public scrutiny. Every choice was freighted with moral reflection. Was I being honest? Was I responsible in how I presented myself to the world? Was I practicing empathy for myself while also considering the social ripples of my actions? I began keeping a journal, not to document the physical aspects, but to trace the psychological contours of my experience, the relief in honesty, the guilt in hiding, the thrill of small victories over fear. I recorded how my sense of self fluctuated, how internal resistance ebbed and flowed, how empathy expanded, not just toward others, but toward myself. This practice anchored me. It taught me that transformation wasn't an endpoint, but a process, a continuous dialogue between the person I had been and the person I was learning to be. Looking back now, I can see that these earliest days were the hinge on which everything else turned. They were quiet, often lonely, and painfully introspective, but they laid the foundation for a deeper understanding of identity, morality, and relational accountability. They reminded me that transformation, to be meaningful, must be both internally honest and socially conscientious, that one cannot merely change outward forms without reckoning with the inner architecture of selfhood. I had never realized how much the world teaches you to hide pieces of yourself until those pieces started pressing for attention. At first, it was subtle. A glance lingered too long in the mirror, a choice of fabric felt unusually comforting, a borrowed scarf or soft sweater seemed to settle some anxiety that had been persistent for years. These were private gestures, unnoticed by anyone else, but each one carried weight. It was as if a secret current of existence had been flowing beneath the surface of my daily life, and only now was it rising to meet me with an insistence I could no longer ignore. The first mornings I dressed in ways that aligned more closely with my internal self were exercises in tension and reflection. I remember standing in front of the mirror, hands hovering over buttons and zippers, heart pounding not from excitement, but from a quiet fear I had never quite felt before. I was not seeking attention, nor was I trying to provoke. I was negotiating with myself, with the weight of internalized expectations, with the consequences of how my choices might ripple outward. Every fold of fabric, every movement of my hands, every breath I took felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. My wife's presence in all this was both anchor and magnifying glass. She had never asked me to perform a certain way, nor had she ever expressed judgment. She simply observed, and sometimes offered a quiet comment that revealed she understood more than I thought possible. "You look like you belong there," she said once, and the simplicity of it unsettled me more than any complex argument could have. It was not flattery, it was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, I learned, is heavier than applause, it is a responsibility. I felt the weight of living up to that recognition, of being honest with her as well as myself, of sustaining empathy in the ways I chose to present myself. Outside the house, every public movement felt like negotiation with the world. At first, I did not try to be seen, avoiding crowded streets, lingering only in familiar shops, choosing times when I might feel invisible. But invisibility brought its own unease. I realized that self-acceptance does not flourish in hiding. It is tested, like a muscle, by exposure to reality. So I began to leave the house with small, intentional choices, perhaps a scarf that was slightly longer, a color palette that felt natural to me, a hairstyle that softened edges I had spent decades trying to harden. Each step was a balance between safety, authenticity, and moral reflection. Was I being true to myself? Was I acting responsibly toward others who might see me? Could I carry my identity in the world without deception, but without recklessness? I discovered that crossdressing was not merely about clothes or appearances, it was a prism through which I could examine my own assumptions. I became acutely aware of how social norms shape behavior, how gestures are interpreted, and how people assign meaning to surface-level cues. I realized that empathy is often limited by perception, that assumptions about identity can create both silent bonds and invisible barriers. Each interaction became a study in human psychology. A clerk might smile at me differently than before, or strangers might speak more slowly, as if calibrating language to an unspoken puzzle. I took note of these micro-reactions not as judgment, but as information, a way to understand not just myself, but how society responds to nonconformity, and how that response shapes behavior in subtle but enduring ways. In parallel, my internal dialogue grew more complex. I wrestled with guilt and obligation, not out of shame for who I was, but from a genuine awareness that choices carry consequences. I worried about friends, family, colleagues. Would they see me clearly, or through filters of expectation and fear? How could I honor my truth while remaining attentive to the feelings of those who loved me? These questions did not have easy answers. I found myself reflecting daily, sometimes hourly, on the ethics of self-expression. It became clear that transformation is never merely personal, it is relational, woven into the lives of others, and inseparable from the moral frameworks we inhabit. One of the most poignant realizations came in quiet solitude, late at night, when the house was still. I would sit in the living room, often with my journal, and try to articulate the subtle changes happening within me. Not changes in physical appearance, but shifts in cognition, feeling, and identity. I noticed how small acts of honesty, acknowledging my discomfort in social rigidity, giving myself permission to inhabit feminine-coded behaviors in private, began to reshape my sense of self. Confidence was not instantaneous, it came in fragments, in moments of recognition, in the soft affirmation that I could be myself without eroding integrity or compassion. Relationships became a mirror as much as a crucible. Conversations with my wife deepened, not through drama, but through nuanced negotiation. We discussed boundaries, perception, and trust in ways we had never articulated before. I learned that honesty is not simply saying what one feels, it is expressing it with awareness of the other's perspective, anticipating ripple effects, and being accountable for choices that extend beyond oneself. It was exhausting and exhilarating simultaneously, and it taught me that ethical living is inseparable from authentic selfhood. At work, I tread carefully. Small details, a softer tone in emails, a slightly altered posture, choices in clothing, were measured experiments in self-expression and social perception. Each interaction required thought. Would revealing this aspect of myself compromise professionalism? Or could I cultivate an environment where authenticity was not only safe, but respected? Every small victory, being treated with dignity while presenting authentically, observing subtle shifts in how colleagues engaged, felt profound. I realized that identity is not just a personal journey, it is a negotiation with culture, a dialogue with society, and an ethical practice in everyday life. By the time several months had passed, I understood that transformation was no longer about private experimentation. It had become a moral and psychological landscape I inhabited fully. I had learned to calibrate empathy toward myself and others, to recognize social signals without being constrained by them, and to navigate fear, uncertainty, and desire with integrity. The journey was still ongoing, but I could see the contours of my emerging self with clarity, a self that demanded honesty, accountability, and reflection as much as freedom, self-recognition, and authenticity. These days, when I look back on the first steps, I am struck not by the physical acts of transformation, but by the slow, deliberate reshaping of moral and emotional consciousness. I see how courage is not flamboyant, but meticulous. I see how identity is not merely performed, but negotiated, nurtured, and ethically maintained. And I understand that true growth, emotional, social, and psychological, is inseparable from attentiveness to the world beyond oneself, and to the delicate interplay between self and society. The following months unfolded like a careful, deliberate examination of a self I had only just begun to recognize. Every day became a laboratory, and every interaction a test of both courage and conscience. I had long assumed that identity was fixed, or at least bounded by the expectations I had internalized from childhood. But the more I engaged with my reflection, with my clothing, my voice, my gestures, even the subtle shifts in how I carried myself, the more I realized that identity is a living, negotiating organism. It is not granted, it is discovered, and each discovery demands attention, thoughtfulness, and, above all, honesty. One afternoon, I found myself walking through a small park near my home, wearing a cardigan that felt, in some inexplicable way, like a statement of authenticity. I was cautious, deliberately moving along less crowded paths, yet I felt a swelling sense of liberation with every step. Not because I was attempting to be noticed, but because I was inhabiting myself fully, in a way that no longer shrank to avoid attention or judgment. As I passed a group of parents with children, I observed their glances, some curious, some polite, some indifferent, and I realized, quietly and with some trepidation, that human perception is endlessly nuanced. People notice more than we think, but often, they assign meaning less harshly than we imagine. It was a lesson in humility. Our fear of misjudgment frequently exceeds the reality. At home, the negotiation with my wife deepened. We began to have conversations that were not about clothes or appearances, but about ethics, responsibility, and relational integrity. She asked questions that startled me, not out of suspicion, but out of care. "How do you want me to witness this journey?" she would ask. Or, "What do you need from me to remain accountable to yourself?" These questions forced me to examine motives I had rarely articulated even to myself. I began to understand that transformation is as much about moral accountability as it is about self-expression. Each decision carried weight, small acts of honesty, choices about disclosure, gestures of trust. I was learning that identity is not solitary, it exists in relation to others, and its expression is ethically implicated in every interaction. My work life became another arena of introspection and challenge. I could not rush the public disclosure of my evolving self. Instead, I experimented in subtler ways, adapting body language, modulating tone, adjusting posture and presentation to reflect a growing alignment with my internal self while maintaining professionalism. It was a delicate balance. I had to constantly assess how colleagues perceived me, how implicit biases might color their reactions, and how my own fear or confidence affected their engagement. Each success, small nods of respect, inclusive conversation, genuine recognition of competence, felt like a quiet triumph. And each misstep, whether awkward phrasing or a hesitant reveal of some personal truth, became an opportunity to practice empathy, reflection, and resilience. I also began to see the relational ripples of my transformation extend beyond my immediate circle. Friends who had long known me in one frame of identity responded in a variety of ways: curiosity, confusion, hesitation, and sometimes avoidance. I learned to approach each encounter with patience and intentionality, recognizing that their responses were rooted in pre-existing assumptions, not malice. I found myself explaining less and listening more, realizing that empathy involves both articulating one's truth and understanding the constraints and limitations in others' capacity to receive it. It was a slow, sometimes painful lesson. Identity, no matter how authentic, is a relational phenomenon. There were moments, too, when solitude became necessary, not in secrecy, but in reflection. I would sit quietly, journal open, and trace the contours of my emotional landscape, the thrill of small victories, the ache of resistance, the uncertainty of moral responsibility. I documented the shifts in my own perception, how I experienced the world differently when inhabiting a body and presentation aligned with my emerging identity. Colors felt sharper, sounds more attuned, movement less constrained. But the most profound change was internal. I could feel empathy expanding, not as a forced duty, but as a natural byproduct of living more fully in a state of vulnerability and authenticity. One evening, during a long conversation with my wife, I realized something crucial. My transformation was teaching me not only about myself, but about the ethics of interaction, the morality of presence, and the weight of awareness in human relationships. She asked a question that I had not anticipated. Do you feel that people are ready for this version of you? And I had to admit, not entirely. Society is rarely ready for full authenticity. It prefers the neat categories, the predictable roles. Yet, in that admission, I also understood a moral imperative. Readiness is not a prerequisite for truth. I could not defer my own honesty indefinitely in order to accommodate the comfort of others. I could, however, approach disclosure with integrity, patience, and sensitivity. As time passed, I began to see patterns in my own emotional evolution. Anxiety, which had been constant in the early days, began to ebb. Where once fear had dominated, reflection and self-accountability now guided me. I recognized that fear often masquerades as prudence, that courage is not absence of fear, but the willingness to act ethically despite it. Each small step, each careful experiment in presentation or conversation, was a form of moral training. I was learning to inhabit my identity responsibly, to calibrate authenticity with awareness, to pursue self-realization while honoring the dignity of others. I also became increasingly conscious of the philosophical dimension of my journey. Gender, expression, identity, all these concepts are often framed as personal or social constructs. But through lived experience, I realized they are ethical constructs as well. They demand reflection, responsibility, and ongoing negotiation. Every choice about self-presentation was a question: how do I exist authentically? How do I preserve integrity in relationships? How do I respond to assumptions and judgments with empathy rather than resentment? Transformation, I now understood, was inseparable from moral consciousness. Some of the most striking moments came unexpectedly. A casual conversation at a cafe, a shared joke with a colleague, the quiet smile of a friend, these gestures, small on the surface, confirmed the possibility of connection without compromise. They reminded me that authenticity need not alienate, and that relational trust can coexist with transformation. Yet, these affirmations also reinforced the fragility of progress. Misunderstanding could arise anywhere, and responsibility demanded constant attention. There was no single victory, only ongoing negotiation. I began to see, with increasing clarity, that my identity was no longer just an internal narrative, but a lived ethics. It was not defined solely by clothing, voice, or posture, but by the way I engaged with the world, how I practiced empathy, and how I sustained moral attention to both self and others. Crossdressing, once a private curiosity, had become a lens through which I could understand broader human truths, the subtle interplay of perception and assumption, the social negotiation inherent in authenticity, the ethical responsibility that accompanies visibility. By this point, I could no longer separate the personal from the philosophical. Transformation was not a project to be completed, nor a secret to be concealed. It was an ongoing process of discovery, reflection, and moral engagement. Every day offered lessons in patience, humility, and responsibility. Every interaction, public or private, became a site of ethical practice. And gradually, I came to understand that courage is not flamboyant or performative, it is meticulous, reflective, and accountable. Identity, lived fully, is never solitary, it is relational, ethical, and profoundly human. Would you like me to continue to the next part, where we begin exploring deeper societal interaction, public presence, and long-term relational impacts? The months that followed felt like walking through a landscape that was at once familiar and entirely new. It was not the world itself that had changed, it was me, and the perception of myself in relation to it. I had begun venturing into public spaces with a cautious confidence, aware that every gesture, every shift in posture or voice, could ripple outward in ways I might not anticipate. And yet, the fear that had dominated those earliest days had softened. It did not vanish, but it became a companion rather than a master, a reminder to move carefully, reflectively, and ethically. I started taking longer walks through the city, observing life from the perspective of someone who knew the fragility of social perception. People reacted in subtle ways, some with kindness, some with confusion, others without noticing at all. I noticed the unspoken choreography of public interaction, how a glance lingers, how a smile can affirm, how a pause can invite connection or alienation. These observations became part of my moral education. I realized that empathy is not just an inward feeling but a skill that must be exercised actively, especially when inhabiting spaces where difference is visible. Work became a more intricate terrain. I had long been careful, disciplined, and conscious of the professional persona I projected. But now, authenticity demanded negotiation with pre-existing assumptions. I experimented in small ways, adjusting the subtle cadence of speech, softening certain gestures, choosing attire that expressed my emerging identity without violating the norms of professionalism. Each interaction became a careful test. Could I be fully myself while maintaining respect, credibility, and responsibility? Most days, the answer was yes, but the process was slow, deliberate, and never free from doubt. There were, of course, moments of miscalculation. A casual remark might be misinterpreted, a small gesture might provoke curiosity or confusion. In these moments, I discovered patience as a moral tool. Instead of reacting defensively, I practiced explanation, clarification, and empathy. I learned to anticipate the unspoken questions in others' minds, to answer them not with defensiveness, but with honesty and care. This was not always easy, and it often demanded emotional labor I had never considered before. Yet with each encounter, I grew more adept at balancing authenticity with social awareness, and anxiety gradually yielded to deliberate reflection. Friendships, too, were tested and strengthened in unexpected ways. Some friends embraced the changes immediately, offering support, curiosity, and conversation that deepened connection. Others hesitated, uncertain how to integrate this new dimension of my identity into the relationship. I learned that empathy is reciprocal. It requires listening as much as speaking, and patience as much as honesty. I practiced explaining my experience not to persuade, but to illuminate. Some relationships expanded, some contracted. Both outcomes were valuable, teaching me that identity cannot be negotiated at the expense of selfhood, nor can it exist without attentiveness to relational integrity. Family presented its own intricate challenges. Conversations were deliberate, reflective, and often emotionally taxing. I discovered that honesty, once a personal moral imperative, becomes a shared ethical responsibility when it intersects with those you love. I had to navigate fear, expectation, and the weight of history in ways that demanded not only authenticity but careful listening, compassion, and moral discernment. I had to recognize their concerns without yielding my truth, to respond with patience without compromising integrity. These were lessons in accountability at a level I had not previously understood, and they reshaped my understanding of what transformation truly entails, not spectacle, not defiance, but conscientious evolution. One of the most profound realizations came during a routine visit to a cafe. I was seated near a window, journaling, observing the rhythm of the street, when a stranger approached, a woman, older than I am now, who looked at me with curiosity tempered by gentle kindness. "Excuse me," she said, "I hope this isn't intrusive, but I just want to say, you seem very comfortable in yourself." Her words struck me in a way nothing else had. It was not admiration, nor was it judgment, it was recognition. And recognition, I realized, carries moral weight. To be seen fully, even briefly, is both a privilege and a responsibility. I had to live in a way worthy of being recognized, not for appearance, but for integrity, honesty, and attentiveness to self and others. As I reflected on that moment, I understood more clearly the continuum between private and public transformation. In solitude, I could explore identity, practice reflection, and negotiate morality. In public, I had to translate that internal work into observable action, speech, posture, and presence that aligned with the evolving self while honoring social dynamics. The ethical dimension of authenticity became clearer with each day. I began thinking less about fear of judgment and more about the way my presence, however subtle, could illuminate, challenge, or affirm the perceptions of others. I was learning that identity is a social practice as much as a personal one. At home, my relationship with my wife evolved in tandem. It was no longer enough for us to simply acknowledge each other's presence. We began actively cultivating dialogue around growth, accountability, and moral reflection. I noticed, for example, that our conversations became more deliberate. We discussed boundaries, social strategies, and ethical approaches to encounters with friends, family, and colleagues. She encouraged me to articulate not only what I felt, but why I acted, and to consider how my actions resonated beyond our private sphere. These discussions deepened my awareness that transformation is relational, ethical, and continuous. A particularly challenging moment came when a close friend expressed discomfort. She did not reject me, but her hesitation and questions revealed the limits of understanding shaped by societal norms. In response, I chose patience, listening carefully, resisting the urge to defend, explain, or persuade aggressively. I realized that empathy is exercised not only in comfort, but in discomfort. It is tested when our choices unsettle others. By embracing these moments with integrity, I cultivated a sense of moral authority grounded not in dominance, but in reflection, accountability, and compassion. By the end of that year, I began to notice subtle, profound changes in my self-perception. Where once I had approached mirrors, clothing, and public interaction with fear and hesitation, I now encountered them with deliberate care. I had learned to inhabit my body with awareness, to calibrate gestures with reflection, to project presence without compromising authenticity. The internal dissonance that had characterized my earliest days had softened into a complex harmony, courage paired with prudence, authenticity balanced by empathy, freedom tempered by responsibility. I began writing more extensively in my journal, not as a record of appearance, but as an ethical and emotional map. I documented daily reflections, the small victories, the internal struggles, the moral dilemmas navigated in quiet moments or public interaction. I recorded patterns of response in others, the subtle shifts in perception, and the lessons learned in patience, compassion, and relational integrity. Through this, I discovered that transformation is not a single event, nor is it completed through spectacle. It is a practice, a continuous calibration of self-awareness, moral responsibility, and empathy extended outward into the world. Looking back on this period, I realized that it was the point at which internal reflection and external experience began to converge. I had moved beyond the privacy of experimentation into a lived engagement with society, with relationships, and with my own evolving consciousness. Every encounter, every choice, every moment of observation or dialogue contributed to a profound understanding that identity is ethical, relational, and dynamic, that courage is deliberate and reflective, and that authenticity is inseparable from attentiveness to the world around us. Would you like me to continue to the next part, where the narrator explores long-term social integration, public confidence, and ethical self-expression in broader society? The years that followed were less about sudden revelation and more about steady cultivation. Transformation, I had learned, is never a single event. It is a lifelong dialogue between internal honesty and external engagement, between moral responsibility and personal freedom. Each day became a practice in observation, reflection, and ethical action, and I found that the lessons of my early experimentation were magnified as I moved further into public spaces, into deeper relational contexts, and into situations where stakes were higher. I began to notice, with increasing clarity, the ways in which social norms and implicit expectations shape behavior. Even mundane interactions, a nod from a stranger, a greeting from a colleague, the subtle rhythms of conversation, carried unspoken assumptions about gender, identity, and propriety. Where once I might have recoiled from the weight of such scrutiny, I now approached it with deliberate observation. I learned to inhabit my presence with mindfulness, not seeking approval, not performing for recognition, but projecting integrity, authenticity, and attentiveness. One of the most profound challenges during this period was negotiating visibility. I had grown comfortable in private, but public acknowledgement carried risks, misperception, curiosity, or even subtle forms of bias. Each outing required a measure of courage paired with strategic thought. How much of myself could I reveal in casual conversation? Which gestures and expressions would align with my internal truth while remaining considerate of social dynamics? I realized that authenticity is not reckless abandon, it is a form of moral engagement, a continuous balancing act between selfhood and relational awareness. Work became an arena of both challenge and education. I took on leadership responsibilities, which demanded not only competence but a capacity to model ethical integrity and empathy. My evolving presence prompted reflection on assumptions I had internalized and those projected onto me by others. Meetings, presentations, and collaborations became exercises in nuanced observation, listening carefully, interpreting reactions, adjusting communication without compromising identity, and fostering environments where honesty and respect could coexist. I discovered that leadership is inseparable from relational intelligence, and that identity, when integrated authentically, enhances moral and social awareness rather than hindering it. Friendships evolved in complexity as well. Some relationships deepened, others contracted, and new ones emerged from spaces of mutual recognition and trust. I realized that authenticity, while ethically necessary, does not always align with the comfort zones of others. Some friends needed time to adjust, some withdrew, and others flourished in the clarity of shared vulnerability. Each interaction demanded patience, reflection, and empathy. I learned that relational resilience depends not on forcing understanding, but on modeling integrity, demonstrating accountability, and honoring the emotional realities of those around us. Family remained an ongoing site of reflection. I recognized that blood ties do not automatically confer understanding or acceptance, and that navigating these relationships required both courage and strategic communication. Conversations were deliberate, often long, and sometimes emotionally draining. Yet they were also profoundly rewarding. Moments of clarity, shared insight, and authentic connection reinforced my belief that identity is inseparable from relational responsibility. I had to honor my truth while remaining attentive to the perspectives of others, a moral practice as demanding as any public engagement. Social awareness deepened in unexpected ways. I became attuned to subtle cues of inclusion, exclusion, bias, and expectation. Observing the world through the lens of a visible transformation taught me that social perception is often shaped by unconscious assumptions, and that empathy requires ongoing education. I began mentoring others in small ways, offering guidance on authenticity, communication, and relational ethics, not because I assumed expertise, but because I had developed first-hand insight into the challenges and nuances of inhabiting a non-conforming identity. I realized that lived experience can be a form of education in itself, a way to cultivate understanding without judgment or spectacle. Romantic and emotional intimacy also transformed. My marriage, having endured the initial turbulence of honesty and negotiation, entered a new phase. The trust and mutual respect we had cultivated became the foundation for deeper connection. Conversations about boundaries, desires, and ethical engagement continued, but now they were infused with shared understanding and a recognition of the moral weight of presence. I began to understand that love, like identity, is a practice, an ongoing negotiation of authenticity, empathy, and accountability. Each day offered opportunities to reinforce integrity, to validate experiences, and to sustain relational depth. Public interaction became increasingly integrated into daily life. I moved through spaces with confidence tempered by ethical reflection. I no longer feared casual observation or social misunderstanding. Instead, I approached each encounter as an opportunity to practice attentiveness, noticing reactions without judgment, responding with clarity, and maintaining alignment with my internal values. Even small acts, holding a door, engaging in conversation, sharing a smile, became exercises in conscious presence, a way to inhabit the world fully without compromise. I also discovered profound lessons in moral humility. Not every reaction was favorable, not every encounter was smooth. Moments of misunderstanding, microaggression, or subtle bias were inevitable. But instead of retreating into defensiveness or frustration, I learned to reflect on my own responses, to cultivate patience, and to extend empathy toward those who struggle to comprehend experiences outside their own framework. I realized that moral courage is not merely about asserting one's truth, but about sustaining ethical engagement in the face of uncertainty, discomfort, or partial understanding. Introspection became deeper, more structured. I maintained daily reflections in my journal, not to catalog appearance, but to trace emotional, moral, and social growth. I examined patterns in my own behavior, moments of anxiety or pride, successes and missteps in interpersonal engagement. Each entry reinforced the understanding that transformation is not linear, that ethical growth is ongoing, and that self-awareness is inseparable from attentiveness to others. I discovered that the narrative of identity is not solely personal, it is co-authored through every interaction, every choice, and every act of reflection. As time passed, I recognized the full arc of what I had been building. My identity was no longer tentative, private, or experimental. It had become integrated, relational, and ethically grounded. I had cultivated patience, empathy, and moral attentiveness in ways that extended far beyond self-expression. I had learned that transformation carries responsibility to oneself, to loved ones, to colleagues, and to society at large. Identity, fully lived, is inseparable from accountability, reflection, and deliberate engagement. Perhaps the most profound realization came quietly, in the solitude of an evening spent journaling and observing the city through my apartment window. I saw not only the reflection in the glass, but the reflection of a journey spanning years, a journey from fear to cautious experimentation, from internal negotiation to public presence, from anxiety to moral attentiveness. I recognized that courage is deliberate, that authenticity is relational, and that ethical living requires continuous reflection. Transformation, in its deepest sense, is not simply a personal revelation, it is a moral, social, and emotional practice that shapes both self and world. And in that moment, I understood something that no experiment, conversation, or observation had fully revealed before: living authentically, with integrity, empathy, and awareness, is the ultimate form of transformation. It is a practice without finality, a journey without a single endpoint, but one whose meaning is measured in relational depth, moral reflection, and the quiet courage of inhabiting truth in every interaction. Would you like me to continue to the final part 6, where the narrator reflects on complete integration, lasting moral and social insight, and the culmination of identity and empathy? I sometimes think of identity as a river, slow at times, turbulent at others, shaped not only by the banks it encounters but also by the stones, currents, and tributaries that feed it. My journey had always been like that river, at first a trickle, private and uncertain, later, a current navigating landscapes both familiar and unfamiliar, and finally, a river that could run visibly, with integrity, confidence, and awareness of the world it touched. By this point, I had learned that living authentically is never a matter of completing a checklist or achieving a static form. It is an ongoing negotiation between self-perception, moral responsibility, and social engagement. The most striking change was not visible in any mirror, photograph, or reflection, it was internal. I had cultivated a capacity for self-observation that was neither judgmental nor indulgent, a form of mindfulness that allowed me to recognize subtle fluctuations in my emotions, my impulses, and my sense of relational responsibility. I noticed when pride or impatience crept in, when fear or hesitation clouded judgment, and when empathy could be expanded further. Each observation became an opportunity for adjustment, a chance to practice integrity, patience, and deliberate kindness. I came to understand that identity is a living ethical practice. Every thought, choice, and interaction shapes not just who I am, but who I am in relation to others. Public presence had become less of a performance and more of a conscious dialogue. I no longer measured myself solely by the comfort or scrutiny of others, but by the integrity and attentiveness I brought into each interaction. I observed not only how people reacted to me, but how I responded to them, with patience, honesty, and reflection. There were moments of misreading, misunderstanding, or subtle judgment, but these became opportunities rather than threats. I had learned to navigate the world with a moral compass, choosing disclosure when it mattered, exercising discretion when it mattered, and remaining ethically consistent in every situation. Work, relationships, and social life had matured along parallel lines. I discovered that authenticity strengthens rather than undermines responsibility. By inhabiting my identity fully yet consciously, I fostered trust, credibility, and relational depth. My colleagues recognized not only my competence but also the clarity of my ethical presence, someone who acted thoughtfully, acknowledged mistakes, and extended empathy. Friends and family engaged with me more fully because my transparency was tempered by care, and my vulnerability reinforced relational trust. Transformation had ceased to be about secrecy or experimentation. It had become a practice in ethical living, relational attentiveness, and consistent self-awareness. The private and public aspects of my life began to converge. The quiet reflections I had recorded in journals for years, thoughts about fear, courage, empathy, and moral responsibility, now informed every decision I made in social and professional contexts. I recognized that my internal dialogue was inseparable from my outward actions. Each thought shaped behavior, each reflection guided engagement, and each ethical choice reinforced identity. It was a profound lesson in the inseparability of internal and external authenticity. I also learned to embrace complexity without feeling compelled to simplify it for others or for myself. Identity is layered, fluid, and relational. It encompasses history, perception, aspiration, morality, and emotional nuance. I had once assumed that transformation could be reduced to appearance, clothing, or behavior. I now understood that the most significant transformation is psychological, ethical, and relational, learning to inhabit oneself fully while attending to the subtle rhythms of social expectation, relational trust, and moral responsibility. One of the most profound insights of this stage was the recognition of relational ethical gravity. Every choice, no matter how minor, carried consequence, for colleagues, friends, family, and even strangers. I had to consider not only my truth, but the ways in which it intersected with the lives of others. This did not mean suppressing identity, it meant calibrating action with reflection, balancing authenticity with empathy, and acting with moral intentionality. I discovered that courage is ethical, that honesty is relational, and that integrity is most meaningful when tested by the complexity of human interaction. Romantic and familial relationships reached new levels of depth. My marriage, which had been a site of careful negotiation in the earliest days, had evolved into a partnership defined by transparency, patience, and mutual ethical engagement. Conversations about boundaries, expectation, and vulnerability became richer, guided by years of reflection and lived practice. I realized that love is not static, it is a moral and emotional practice. Every act of honesty, every moment of attentive listening, every gesture of care reinforces relational depth and personal integrity. Social interactions, too, became spaces of conscious practice. Casual conversations, public appearances, and daily gestures were imbued with reflection. How would my presence be perceived? How could I respond ethically to misunderstanding or subtle bias? Could I maintain authenticity while extending empathy? These questions guided not only action but thought, shaping a consistent approach to life that blended self-expression with moral awareness. I realized that social visibility, when combined with ethical attentiveness, becomes a form of education, not didactic, but relational, a lived demonstration that authenticity and accountability can coexist. I also observed my own growth in patience and humility. Not every interaction would be smooth, not every expectation met, not every perception aligned. But I learned to approach friction with curiosity rather than defensiveness. Misunderstanding became a tool for reflection, hesitation became an opportunity for dialogue, discomfort became a prompt for empathy. I had learned that moral courage is measured not in dramatic declarations but in sustained attentiveness, ethical decision-making, and the quiet work of integrating identity into the full spectrum of human experience. In moments of solitude, I reflected on the trajectory from the earliest days, from hesitant experimentation, private reflection, and internal negotiation, to deliberate public presence, relational engagement, and ethical responsibility. Each phase had been necessary, each lesson earned through observation, dialogue, and reflection. Transformation, I now understood fully, is a continuous practice, a river shaped by both internal currents and external landscapes, requiring constant attention, adjustment, and care. Ultimately, I came to see that living authentically, ethically, and relationally is the culmination of transformation. It is not defined by clothing, posture, or surface appearances, it is defined by the courage to inhabit one's truth while sustaining empathy, responsibility, and integrity. It is the quiet but profound awareness that every choice shapes both self and world, that identity is inseparable from ethical practice, and that authenticity requires reflection, accountability, and sustained engagement with others. And in that recognition, I found a sense of completion, not an endpoint, but a profound integration. My identity was no longer compartmentalized, tentative, or experimental. It was fully present, relationally engaged, and ethically grounded. The river of my transformation had broadened, deepened, and clarified. It carried both the water of self-knowledge and the currents of responsibility, flowing continuously through life, shaping each encounter, each relationship, and each reflection. I realized, finally, that transformation matters not only emotionally but ethically. It cultivates empathy, moral reflection, and relational integrity. It illuminates the subtleties of social perception, the power of patient dialogue, and the profound responsibility inherent in inhabiting a visible, authentic self. Transformation, fully realized, is a practice in living ethically, in balancing courage with care, freedom with accountability, and identity with relational awareness. And in that quiet, reflective clarity, I understood that I had become not only the person I had longed to be internally, but the person I could sustain ethically, relationally, and morally in the world, a fully integrated, empathetic, and aware human being, capable of navigating identity with honesty, responsibility, and grace.